I call the book Text Less Traveled. It covers Hebrews, the Catholic epistles, so we're talking about James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and then the book of Revelation. And I call it Text Less Traveled because these are texts that at least many Catholics don't really encounter that frequently. And I think there's three reasons for that. One is they're relegated to the end of the New Testament canon. If you open up a table of contents, you start with the Gospels, and then you have the Acts of the Apostles, the story of the early church, which ends with this note that Paul was imprisoned in Rome, but proclaiming the gospel without hindrance, and that's a nice segue to the letter to the Romans, and you have the whole Pauline corpus. And it's not till you get past that you get the Hebrews, the Catholic epistles, and Revelations. They're literally at the end of the table of contents. In the church's liturgy, they don't receive much proclamation. It's usually in the context of the second reading, and those of us who preach the Catholic lectionary, the gospel is the Catholic canon within the canon. Notice, when we come to worship, we sit down, we hear the first reading, which is usually from the Old Testament. Word of the Lord, thanks be to God. We hear the second reading from one of the epistles, thanks be to God. Then we stand up and we sing Alleluia, and sometimes we read from a different book, and it's only certain people who are privileged to proclaim the gospel, deacons and priests. So that's our canon within the canon, and that reading is synced or coordinated with the first reading. The second reading is on its own cycle. Point being that it's hard to preach on the second reading often, and it's a shame because we rarely people don't hear much about these books. So I got this idea of that how can I talk about them? And I read a book review in the New York Times on Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, the most misunderstood poem in America. And it's interesting. I said, I think I've got an idea here. Text Less Traveled. And what I learned from reading this review was when we think of the road less, when we think of that poem, at least my understanding of it always was, and I think the way a lot of us understand it, is the less traveled road that made all the difference. That's the way you take a risk. You don't follow the crowd. You go on your own. It's kind of staking your own way, and that's what made all the difference. But what this literary critic, David Orr, was pointing out, he pointed out a couple of things. One is there's a few indications in the text that day both paths lay evenly trodden. And there's actually two notices like that. And then it's at the end of the poem that the author projects himself forward and looking back in time, reflecting on this walk in the woods. And this author says, this poem is really about how we, in retrospect, look back at our lives and tell the story of our lives in ways that make sense of the decisions we've made. And I thought, that's interesting. So I talk about this a little bit in my introduction. I said, if a poem about a walk in the woods has evoked so much thought and interpretation and possible meanings, how much more should we spend time with these texts that Christians consider to be divine revelation and really wrestle with them? And so my point, I try to entice my reader, these texts less traveled, they might not make all the difference, but especially when we focus on things we wouldn't have without them, we're going to find out they make a significant difference, or can, in our lives of faith. So that's how the title came about.